What the world needs now is love, sweet love. That's the only thing.
The beloved. Little, yeah.
So you know,
Kind of.
there's just too little of. Last Sunday was Good Shepherd Sunday. We can call this Sunday the Sunday of love, or the announcement of the love which the disciples are to show to one another and the way in which they are to conduct their discipleship. Love. We all know that song. We've heard lots of songs about love. Indeed, the radio and CDs and idol songs and all those music is often songs about love or the lack of it. Unrequited love. Love that doesn't show up. Love that's forgotten and left behind. That song says that the world is suffering from a lack of love. What could that lack of love be? A lack of respect for one another, a lack for understanding of other peoples, a lack of fully caring about others, just love that isn't quite what it ought to be. Jesus in this gospel today speaks to his disciples, and what he says is often said in John's gospel. Jesus first speaks of what we call theologically as Christology, talking about the Christ. First, he talks about that the Son of Man himself is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and God will glorify him at once. He's speaking of himself, the Christ of God. And then he moves quickly from explaining, as he often did, who he is, where he comes from, who he owes his existence to, and what his ministry and mission is about, that he is the Christ of God and identifies himself as such. But then he moves on from Christology to discipleship. What is it to know the Christ, to know Jesus, and then to follow him? And he tells them, he alerts them, he lets them know that in a little while he will no longer be with them. And so he says, I give you a new commandment. Now remember, this commandment, or something similar to it, was given on the evening in which he was in the upper room, and gave them a commandment that they ought to love one another. And he gave them an example. The washing of feet, they ought to become servants to one another and care for others, humbling themselves with others. Washing feet was the example. Today in this reading from John, he says, I give you a new commandment, which extends that teaching that he gave at that supper. He says, love one another. Love one another how? As I have loved you. He is the exemplar. The ways in which he's loved them and cared for them and spoke to them and taught them is the way that disciples are expected to care and love others. So you also should love one another. This is how all will know that you are my disciples, when you act as Jesus does and do what Jesus does and love as Jesus did. The world will know that you are his disciples if you have love for one another. Interestingly enough, in John's Gospel, he says that love one another 3 times in this reading. Love one another, love one another, love one another. For a long time, spiritual people and leaders have always said that a lack of love, with that little verse I sang from that 60s song,
Yeah.
was speaking of, it's always been the cause of difficulty in life and in the world. If we lack love, the spirit suffers. Sociologists now are beginning to say if we lack love, our behavior is sometimes different and not fully as it should be. We suffer emotional distress if love is missing in our life. Love between parents and children. Love between partners, husbands and wives. love for our fellow man, human beings, our neighbors, people we meet and walk through the streets of life with every day. Our emotions and our psyche suffers when there seems to be a lack of love. Now medical doctors are starting to say the same thing, that our physical bodies can suffer. We can become physically sick if there's a lack of love in our life. Of course, there's a great list of human disease that causes pain and suffering in life, cancer and heart disease and other kinds of disease. But the greatest disease there is, the greatest disease that affects humankind is the lack of love. The lack of love that prevents others from receiving the kind of medical care they ought to because they live in countries where it's not available. The lack of love that exists and prevents people from having the same kind of life that's caring and fruitful and bountiful that many other people in the world have, as we do here in this country. It's a lack of love that prevents us, many people, from understanding people from other cultures, a lack of love. It's actually selfishness. A lack of love is the cause of evil and difficulty throughout the world among human beings. Not the disease necessarily, not the heart disease, the cancer, the whatever else that the body can take on, but a lack of love that prevents people from caring for one another and providing the resources and abilities and intellect and education that allows people to become fully human and fully alive in the world as children of God. Lack of love is the worst kind of disease that human beings can have. And Jesus was teaching his disciples that they must not have any lack of love for one another. And the kind of love they ought to show one another is the kind of love that he demonstrated when he washed feet, when he became a servant for others. When he saw a woman who was accused by others, he asked her to walk away from sin. He didn't hate her. He just said, sin no more. My mother used to say to her 4 boys, myself and my 3 brothers, whenever we would get in an argument, which was often, he took my shirt, or he's riding my bike, or he did this or he did that, and we would go to her hoping that she would help us, triumph over our brother, be the one that was right. And she would always say, go with your brother and resolve your difference. Go talk to your brother. We wanted her to settle the score. We wanted her to be the one that said who was right and who was wrong. We didn't even want to talk to each other. We wanted Mom to take care of it. She always said, go and resolve your difference with your brother. That's a good example for us in the church.